lecture, we delved a little bit into mechanisms of meiosis with Mendel's pea plants. Mendel was able to cross two strands of pea plants differing at one trait, and he found two fundamental laws of genetics: principles of segregation and principles of independent assortment, which state that we get two copies of a gene from our parents, or alleles, one allele from mom and one allele from dad. And when we form gametes, our alleles separate. And when they separate, they do so independently from other pairs of alleles. Principles of independent assortment. So, Mendel was able to see how alleles flow through the generations using experimental breeding. In humans, we can't really do that, breed experimentally, otherwise we would have problems. So, we use pedigrees. Today we're going to talk about another type of way of viewing patterns of inheritance using gene location and type. And by gene location, I mean depending on the location of where the alleles are, whether they are in autosomal chromosomes or sex-linked chromosomes or mitochondrial, we will see different predictable inheritance patterns. And to see this, to see genes flowing through the generations, we're going to use a pedigree or pedigree analysis, which is a diagram which shows us how conditions are passed through generations. Here we see that males are represented as squares, females are represented as circles, and the affected trait, in this case, is shown in blue. And Roman numerals are used to show the different generations. And also what's important to note for the future and on exams is that sometimes individuals who seem unaffected and who appear unaffected actually are carriers who are capable of passing the disease trait to their children, and sometimes they're marked with a little dot in the center, and sometimes they're not. Here, there are no carriers, but we'll get into that later. And two things to keep in mind is that in science, our hypotheses are never 100% proven, which means that we can only accept our hypotheses by rejecting other ones. So we have to play a little game of devil's advocate. Another thing to keep in mind is that recessive traits aren't the same thing as rare, meaning that we would like to think that rare traits have recessive patterns of inheritance, but that can never be so, since if we were to say that rare traits are recessive, this would mean that there would have to be carriers in the population carrying the trait, which would never happen and would be impossible if the trait was truly rare. Moving on. So there are 5 kinds of patterns of inheritance we see: autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive, Y-linked, and mitochondrial. Let's get into them. Autosomal dominance, we see that there's an equal ratio of male to females that are affected. Every affected child has an affected parent, which means that if we look through the generations, it doesn't skip. The trait doesn't skip generations. Whereas in autosomal recessive, like autosomal dominant, the male to female ratio is the same, but the trait appears to skip generations because the child who has the affected trait can have unaffected parents. And a better word for unaffected, we could use carriers. The children has carrier parents. For X-linked dominant, the male to female ratio varies. Affected sons only get it from their affected mom and not from their affected dad because the fathers can only pass down genes from their Y chromosome. And affected daughters can get it from either parent, from either their mom or their dad. Okay, X-linked recessive. Mostly males are affected. And this is because, as we know, males who are XY have only one copy of the X chromosome, and they inherit one from their mom. So this means that if they inherit the diseased allele that is recessive, they'll automatically be affected. So the affected son has a carrier mom. For Y-linked, only males are affected, since it's on the Y, and girls don't have Y chromosomes, they're XX, as we know. Every son has an affected father, which means that they get it directly from their father, and it doesn't skip generations. Mitochondrial is passed from mom to all her children, and every child is affected. Okay, so now that we've gone through all 6 patterns of inheritance, let's do this example, keeping these 2 ideas in mind, and trying to see which patterns of inheritance won't work and why, and then we'll get down to the right answer. Okay, let's see whether it could be X-linked recessive. Well, we see here that the diseased allele is present in all the generations and doesn't appear to skip the generations, since every affected child has affected parents, so it can't be recessive. But at the same time, it can't be X-linked, because we see that the father in the second generation passes down the allele to his son. And like we said, fathers can only pass the disease trait from their Y genes. So it can't be X-linked recessive. In the same way, it can't be X-linked dominant, even though we see it doesn't skip generations, but it can't be passed down from father to son, only father to daughters. So it can't be the case. Could it be Y-linked? Well, it could, but then we see here that the mother passes it on to the son, and the father passes it on to the daughter. So it can't be, because daughters are affected, and since females are affected, it can't be Y-linked. That's a no. Could it be mitochondrial? Well, we see that a mom passes it down to her children, but then in the second generation, the father passes down the affected allele and condition to his son. So it can't be the case because the father is passing it down as well as the mom. So it can't be mitochondrial. Could it be autosomal recessive? Let's see. It looks like that there is an equal ratio of males to females that are affected, but the diseased allele is present in all generations and doesn't appear to skip any of the generations. So that leads us to the last scenario, autosomal dominant. But let's see if it works. So we said here the requirements for being autosomal dominant is that the male to female ratio is the same. We see we have 3 affected males and 3 affected females. So that works. And every affected child has an affected parent. So it all works out, and that's great. And we learned patterns of inheritance today.